Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you. And apologies once again for the slight delay. There were some technical glitches at the Pearson end, but we're here now and hopefully good to go. So I'm Tim Guilford. I'll just introduce myself very briefly. I'm one of the trainers for Pearson for Modern Languages. I'm also a visiting speaking examiner for A-level Spanish. So hopefully as we go through the session today, I can talk to you about all of the things that you need to know and also hopefully add some value to the things that appear in the PowerPoint presentation. As we go through, I will also try to monitor the chat occasionally. But we will sort of deal with anything like that as we go ahead. I can see now one or two people are wondering where the resources section is. There should be a three little dots more section on the tab at the top, and you should be able to go down and find the resources. But please don't worry too much about that, because if you can't find them now, we'll make sure we get those over to you either at some point during the webinar or afterwards. Okay. Other than that, I will keep an eye on the chat, but I'm got quite a big group today and I'm presenting on my own. So if I do happen to miss one of the comments that anybody makes in the chat or a question that comes along, do please feel free to ask it at the end, and I will make time definitely to answer any questions that you may have. So let's make a start. Well, what we're going to do today in terms of the objectives, we're going to have a look at the speaking requirements in the A-level specifications for all languages. And we'll have colleagues from French, Spanish, German, but also perhaps from Chinese, Italian, Russian, and so on with us today. All of those languages that have a speaking test that follows this particular format. And everything we say really will apply to all of those languages. There are one or two things that are a little different for Chinese, and we will mention those as we go along. So we're also going to look at your absolutely crucial role as the teacher examiner in conducting the speaking assessment, because we do rely very much on our teacher examiners to be effectively the special agents of Pearson. Because every other exam that the students do, of course, they sit in the hall and write on paper, and we don't have any involvement from teachers required in conducting the assessment, but certainly for the speaking we do. So your role is absolutely crucial and essential, and it's important that you get it right. So part of that, of course, is that you're with us this afternoon. So that's great. And we would just say to you, be very careful. You know, whatever we've done today, we are quite a long way ahead of the actual exam that will be coming along next summer. So everything we talk about today, do please try to revisit the instructions, make sure that you've had a really good look at all of the documentation. When I talk about documentation, I talk about specifically past papers, but also about the sample assessment materials for each subject. And in the context of the sample assessment materials, I would remind you that right at the end of the sample assessment materials, there's an example presentation. And we'll talk to you about the presentation going forward in the webinar this afternoon. But there is an exemplar there as well. So sometimes teachers not always aware that that's there. So I would draw your attention to that, because that will support in the context of the language that you're teaching some of the things that I will talk about and say this afternoon. We're also going to work on understanding the things you must and must not do when conducting the speaking assessments. We'll talk about ways to encourage spontaneous speaking as well within the oral. And also at the end, we're going to have a look at the support and so on that's available from Pearson Edexcel to help you get your students ready for this A-level. So the speaking assessments and criteria, we're going to have a look as part of the agenda at A-level task 1, and task 1 you will remember is the speaking card, and that's the card discussion that the students do. And then we're going to look at task 2. And task 2 is the independent research project that students do, and task 2, of course, covers the presentation, the 2-minute presentation, and then the follow-up discussion about the student's research topic. And then we'll kind of give you a bit of an overview of support and that opportunity to answer some questions. Just have a look here. And a couple of questions coming through about whether there will be a recording and so on. Yes, they will absolutely be. I can see somebody, Martha, say, is this speaking for the new GCSE? No, this is we're talking about the speaking test here for the current A-level exam. Okay, so here we go then. We're going to have a look at the requirements of the A-level speaking assessments first of all. So looking first of all at kind of the big picture, and the big picture comes from the Department for Education, who set a set of requirements for all exam boards in terms of what needs to be demonstrated in terms of skills and abilities by the students. So they're expected, all of your students for A-level are expected to use language spontaneously to initiate communication. Keep an eye on that idea of initiate, because we will pick up on those things about interaction as we move through the presentation this afternoon. They're expected to ask as well as answer questions. We always expect them to answer questions, but they're also expected to ask questions. They're expected to express thoughts and feelings, present viewpoints, develop arguments, persuade, analyze, and evaluate in speech. And also that includes that sort of interaction with speakers of the language. They're obviously also expected to apply their knowledge of pronunciation, morphology, syntax, that's the quality of language, vocabulary, idiom, to communicate accurately and coherently. They're expected to use language learning skills and strategies, including communication strategies. So here we're talking about communication strategies, such as perhaps as part of that assessment objective 1, as part of those marks for interaction, things like checking understanding. Do you understand what I mean? Are you following this argument? Does that make sense? So it's that kind of thing that we're wanting to see students doing. And also, if they don't understand the question, asking you, can you explain that in a different way, or do you agree with me, and so on. So, as I say, those communication strategies, such as adjusting the message, circumlocution, self-correction, and those repair strategies. We're also expecting students to develop research skills in the language of study, demonstrating the ability to initiate and conduct individual research on a subject of personal interest relating to the country or countries where the language is spoken. And I'll explain to you the rules that sit around that requirement to conduct the independent research as we get to that part in the presentation. Students are also expected to identify a key question or subject of interest and select relevant information in the language of study from a range of authentic sources, including the internet. It's worth being clear at this point as well, and we will say it again later, that certainly anything the students talk about in their presentation, that must be information that's come from a written source. So we're not really thinking about videos and that kind of thing here. We're talking about information that's come from a written source. Although we say including the internet, it's a written source, and it's also an authentic source. So if it's a book or it's a web page, it must be originally written in the language, published in the language of study by a writer who wrote it originally in that language. So not a translation from English into German or into Italian, into Russian, etc. And then students are also expected to use information to illustrate knowledge and understanding of their research topic. And they're expected to analyse and summarise research findings, elaborating on key points of interest as appropriate through the oral presentation and discussion. So that's really the big picture, and we'll look in detail as we move forward in a moment. Now, the format of the test, how does it actually work as a test? Well, there are two tasks, and task 1 is 6 to 7 minutes long, and task 2 is 10 to 11 minutes long. So before the candidates come in to do the task, we'll do task 1. They will have had 5 minutes of time to prepare one of 2 speaking cards that they're offered. And I'll talk to you again in a moment about how the mechanics of that work. But this is actually in the exam room itself, where you are the teacher examiner. Typically, they will arrive in the exam room. They've already prepared their card. They will come with their card, they will come with their notes that they've made about that. They sit down with you, and you will be checking which card they've got and all of those little bits of admin stuff. And then you start your recording device, and you will announce the name of the candidate, the name of your centre, your name as the teacher examiner, the card that the candidate is doing. You might greet the candidate then, good morning, good afternoon. And you will say to them, and now we're going to begin with task in the target language. Now we're going to begin task 1, and we're going to begin with the first question, and you ask them the question. And from the first word that they say, from the first thing that they say, we start the timing. So 6 to 7 minutes from the first thing that they say, from their first utterance. So that's not 6 to 7 minutes, including you putting their name and candidate number on. Okay, we start the time with the first thing that they say. So you've asked the first question, and as soon as they start to speak, you start that time. And we do 6 to 7 minutes on task 1. Now, task 1 is a sort of 2-part task, and again we'll look further on as we look through the kind of mechanics of it. But the first half of it, the first 3 to 3.5 minutes, will be about the card and the topic on the card, specifically related to the card. And the second half, the second 3 to 3.5 minutes, will be about one of the other sub-themes within the same theme. Okay, and again we'll have a look at that when we get to that point. But if you're in any doubt, have a look at the specification, and the specification will tell you what the 4 themes, 3 or 4, depending whether it's Chinese, I think has 3, but depending on the 4 themes for your particular subject area. And so if perhaps in theme 1, a lot of specifications have things like changes in the family as part of theme 1. If the card is about changes in the family, in the second half of that task 1, you will move not to a different theme, but to one of the other sub-themes within that theme 1. Okay, so each theme will have 2 or 3 sub-themes, and you move to a different one. So that's task 1. Now, it's 6 to 7 minutes. There is no need, once you get to the 6-minute mark, you probably don't need to ask any more questions. Very typically, I always think when I go as an examiner, 1, 2, 3 and away. So you have 2 questions on the card, 1 more question about the card, and that probably covers your 3 minutes initially. And then away to a different sub-theme of the same theme. And then task 2 lasts approximately 10 to 11 minutes, but that includes a 2-minute presentation. So at the end of the task 1, at the end of the 6 to 7 minutes, you say, thank you very much. Now we're going to move on to your presentation. So we'd like to hear your presentation now, and you'll restart the timer, okay? And we ask them to speak for 2 minutes about the topic that they have prepared. And they speak for 2 minutes. If they go over the 2 minutes, you need to stop them. Now, as visiting examiners, and this is good advice for teacher examiners as well, we will allow the students to finish their sentence. So we don't cut them off in mid-flow. But actually, if we're going significantly over the 2 minute mark, by which I mean 2 minutes and 8-10 seconds, you do certainly need to say, we need to stop now, because one of the things that will happen is that examiners will stop marking at that point. So anything they say in the presentation that goes after that 2 minutes and a little bit will probably not be included in the assessment. And again, when I talk to you about the presentation, I'll say something important about that. And then 2 minutes have been used. So 8 to 9 minutes of questions are then asked about their independent research topic, okay, following up on the presentation. So what that means is that the total assessment time is 16 to 18 minutes, and that is plus the 5 minutes preparation time for task 1. Now, these recommended timings are given to enable students to complete each task in order to access the full range of assessment criteria. So that's 6 to 7 minutes and 10 to 11 minutes. Those overall times are recommended times. But there are 2 times that are absolutely essential that you must be very mindful of. One is the 2-minute presentation. So 2 minutes and a tiny bit, and the examiner will stop listening. And the examiner will also stop at the same point, the 18 minutes and a tiny bit, 18 minutes and then the end of the sentence. So you see, if you allow your students to speak in task 1 for 9 minutes, you've then stolen 2 minutes of the task 2 time from them, because we're not going to be giving students credit for going over that 18 minutes. So really, best advice is that you stick very, very closely and in a very disciplined way to those timings, and make sure you have the time clock with you, and that the students know that that's what's happening, that they know that you will stop them at the end of the 2-minute presentation if it goes on for too long. Now, this bit is exactly what I said. Students will not be credited for any conversation which takes place beyond the maximum time allowed. And I just qualify that by saying, except perhaps to finish your sentence. So, 18 minutes and 4 seconds. I don't think we're going to be so cruel that we stop you absolutely there. But again, what I said about the task 1, after 6 minutes, don't ask any more questions. And it's the same with task 2. When you get to the 10-minute mark, there's no need to ask any more questions. We don't need to go right up to that 11-minute mark. And there are a total of 72 marks available for this assessment. So task 1 has 30 marks, that's the card discussion, and task 2 has 42 marks, which is the discussion about the independent research project and the presentation. In fact, what happens is it's 30 marks for task 1, 12 marks for the presentation, and then 30 marks for the follow-up discussion. And you will notice as well in the specification and the sample assessment materials that the mark scheme for task 1 and the second part, the discussion about the independent research project, is the same mark scheme. It's the same wording, the requirements are the same. Now we had a couple of little questions. a couple of questions coming about whether it's advisable to share all of this information with your students. I mean, the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, one of the sort of important things about anything within the kind of UK system is the transparency. So share this information, but also direct them to the website. So make sure that your student knows exactly what they're going to expect and what's going to happen. Okay, we're going to have a look now at task one, and task one, you remember, is the speaking card. So task one then, let's just talk you through how it all works. So we're going to sort of think first of all about the preparation time. So before the start of the preparation time, the invigilator, and you'll have preparation time in a separate room, offers the candidates a choice of sub-themes for task one in accordance with a sequencing grid. So your exams officer will receive a packet of materials. In that will be exam instructions for examiners, and within that pack there is also a sequencing grid that will say candidate one is offered these two sub-themes. The invigilator will speak in English to the candidate, so the invigilator doesn't need to speak the language, and actually shouldn't speak the language. It's important really that the invigilator isn't a person who speaks the language, but they will offer the candidate the choice of two cards. Candidates will see the card, however, only after they've made their choice. So the invigilator will say something like, do you prefer changes in the family or immigration? And the candidate will say immigration, and then they're given that card. And only when they've made that choice are they allowed to turn the card over and begin their preparation time. So all languages, with the exception of Chinese, then have a card with two statements. There's statement A and statement B, and they offer different perspectives on the particular sub-theme. And candidates then need to choose either statement A or statement B. Okay, so they choose one statement from the two that are given on the card, and they only need to prepare to talk about one statement. Chinese is slightly different, and the card only has one statement, and it just offers that one view of this. And this was about removing the reading burden for students with Chinese, because obviously the processing speed may be slower, I suppose we say, for non-Latin and with respect to our Russian colleagues, but left, languages that don't go sort of left to right. And candidates have 5 minutes then to prepare the statement on the stimulus card, and they can take some notes during that task. With the exception of Chinese as well, the candidates will tell you which statement they've chosen before the discussion begins. So, as I mentioned, when they've done their preparation, when they come into the exam room with you, you'll say, which statement have you chosen? B, and it's probably A or B, and it's a good thing also to announce that on the recording when you do the introductory bit. So you say, this is candidate number something, center number something, this is teacher examiner and your name, and the candidate is doing statement 5B, and that's helpful to the person who's marking it because they know instantly what it is they're listening for. It's not absolutely essential, but it's a really helpful thing if you can remember to announce that. So, as I mentioned, then there will be a sequencing grid, and it will look very much like that. So candidate 1 could have card 1 or card 12. So the examiner would say to the candidate, do you prefer changes in the family or the resistance? And then the next candidate, candidate 2, 6 or 7, do you prefer festivals and traditions or the positive impact of immigration in French society, and so on, according to the subject that you're teaching. You work through those 12 candidates, and if you've got more than 12 candidates, when you get back to candidate 13, you start again back with number 1. Okay, and you work through that list as many times as is necessary. So just to recap, the candidates are offered the cards by the invigilator. They don't see the card, but they make their choice, and they do that in English. They're then given the card. They have then 5 minutes to make some notes on a piece of paper, which they're allowed to bring with them into the exam. And we'll have a look at the cards themselves in just a moment. Just as well, those pieces of paper that candidates write on, they're allowed to bring it into the exam room with them, but they mustn't take it out. And they also mustn't take the card out. So one of the things you absolutely must do as a teacher is maintain the security of the material. So they're not allowed to take out the card. They're not allowed to write on the card. And they're also not allowed to keep the notes that they've made. You must keep those, and you must make sure that at the end of the exam window, when all of the exams are done, those notes, forms, and everything goes back to the exams officer. The piece of paper that they write their notes on should also have their name so that it can be identified. And your exams officer should keep those until October half term, really, after the inquiries about results have finished. So let's just have a look at the candidate card. Okay, so the candidate card looks like that. Okay, so one side and the other. So the candidate receives the card face up. Okay, they can then look at that only when they have selected their topic. So here, the candidate card, and you can see it's a French example, but the candidates are given the task, they're given the theme, and they're also given the sub-theme. Okay, so the theme, this is a French version, the theme is changes in French society. The sub-theme is changes in family structures. And they have those 2 statements, A or B. And as you will see with each of the 2 statements, there are 2 bullet points. So in their preparation time, if they've decided to go with statement B, it says marriage for all will never be supported by the French, and they're told you should consider, okay, those two things, the reasons why, etc., and groups who don't accept. And when they come into the exam, you will ask them 2 questions, and the questions that will be in the teacher examiner book are very closely related to those bullet points. So when they are preparing, they will know, certainly initially, very, very securely, really, what it is they're going to talk about. They may not know the exact question, but the questions should not come as a surprise. And so this is now the instructions that are for the teacher examiner. This is the document that I say, even though you've done the training today and you'll have conducted mocks and done all those things, do make sure that you are absolutely familiar with this document. And it's really worth every year, as much as you might think, you know, taking the time to read it through very carefully, because it will reflect most of the things that I've said today, but it's a good thing in terms of your students. These are high stakes exams. These are exams that students are doing to gain access to further and higher education. They really need this A-level, and we really need teacher examiners to conduct the test in such a way that really maximizes the students' potential and shows that to us as examiners. Because as examiners, you recorded the test, you will have uploaded it at the end, but we can only mark what we can hear. And so if there are questions that are amended and not asked as they need to be asked, for example, or if it is that we think the teacher examiner has asked too many easy questions and not stretched the candidate enough, that will limit the marks that we can give. So making sure that you deliver and conduct the test effectively is a really important thing to be doing. It's not difficult to do, but we would just say because it's kind of high stakes, do just make sure that you are absolutely prepared. Now, we've sort of talked a bit about the task one then. As I mentioned, you're going to ask the students the two questions exactly as they are printed for the card. You then maybe ask them one, possibly two other questions about the topic on the card. As you're doing the task one, listen very carefully to what the students say, because your third question might just be, can you give me another example of that? Or what do you think of the thing, you know, something that they've mentioned? So it can be natural and it can be an interactive discussion. And it really should go that way. We're looking for that level of interaction, that backwards and forwards. And then when you move on to the other aspect, the other sub-theme from the same theme, again, the same thing. We're looking now for some more spontaneous questioning, but keep your questioning nice and open as well. Tell me about, talk to me about. Start with an open question, listen to what the students say, and then just dig a little bit deeper, because I always sort of think as an examiner that a fair question is really based on something that the student has given me the impression that they know about. So if they happen to have talked about something, and this is true as well with the independent research project, if they happen to have mentioned something, it's absolutely fair for you to say, oh, tell me a bit more about that. But we have to be very careful about assuming particular factual knowledge, because you never quite know what it is they know or remember in that time. Now, we're just going to sort of begin to think now about task 2 and the independent research topic. Now, the independent research topic really needs to focus on a part of on research which is about a topic which is not specifically part of the taught course. So that list of themes and sub-themes, you will have taught those things. You will have taught them all the stuff that they need to do to talk about those things. But their independent research topic should be something different and should be moved away from that, and particularly moved away from it in a very general sense. Very occasionally, a student will focus on a particular aspect and go into particular depth, and that could be acceptable. But your best strategy really is to guide them away into something that's a bit different. And you know, if you think about the specification, for example, there is lots of scope for that, because certain, depending on the subject, but certain, if we're talking maybe about French, Spanish, German, theme 1, for example, would be only France, Spain, or Germany. So actually, if you were talking about changes in the family in Canada or in Mexico, or Namibia, that would probably be absolutely fine. You know, you can have some overlap with the thematic content, but not specifically with the taught course. But be very careful about that, because it has to be based on independent research. Now, the structure of the discussion then, Okay, so just coming back to task 1 now, there are 2 parts to the discussion. So you have to ask the students the 2 compulsory questions on the card. Okay, the teacher examiner then helps to develop the discussion by asking appropriate follow-on questions. Okay, and part 2, the teacher examiner broadens the discussion to cover aspects of the overall themes. This is all the stuff that I've kind of talked about already. If with this card discussion, you think that the student has an independent research project topic that, okay, as much as you might have guided them not to do that, it overlaps very closely with the content of the card, then the student should really choose the other card. They should really choose the other topic, and they should be aware that we can't really give them knowledge and understanding assessment objective for credit for repeating the same information. So that's a kind of a key aspect. Part 2 then. Part 1, 2 questions on the card and a little bit of follow-up. This is where I say 1, 2, 3 and away. So part 1, 1, 2, 3, the 2 questions on the card, probably 1 more question, and then away to other aspects of the overall theme. Now, in task 1 as well, candidates are expected to ask some questions that elicit opinions as part of natural discourse. And so when they do this, they don't particularly need to ask fully formed questions. It's absolutely fine if they say, "Do you agree with me?" or "What do you think?" or "Have you ever been to that place? Is this somebody that you've heard of?" and things like that. So we're not particularly looking for students to ask complex and fully formed questions, but they should be eliciting your opinion. So do you agree? What do you think? Those are natural questions as part of natural discourse. And the assessment objective 1 marks, those marks for interaction, are very much marks that are about the naturalness of the discussion. And so sometimes students want to prepare a quite complex question. You know, what would you do if you were the president of France? Well, you probably will never be the president of France. So it's not quite such a great question as a simple question that says, "Do you agree?" and "What do you think?" or so on. They also should be confirming that their own points of view have been understood. Do you understand? Does that make sense? That kind of thing. And they also need to take the lead in the discussions. And this is about the springboarding effect, if you like, so that they answer not just the question that you ask them. You might ask them a very specific question, you know, what changes have there been in the family in Spain since the death of Franco, and they might give you some detailed information about that. But then they could actually also use that as a springboard into maybe talking about other aspects, so that it's not just answering the question in a brief way as asked, but it's the wider implications of the question as well. Okay. Now, I saw a message about, you know, whether students are expected to ask questions in task 1. Yes, they should. The mark scheme is the same, so they're getting marks for interaction. So that's the naturalness. But all they need to do really is to check. And did you understand? What do you think? Do you agree? And it's that kind of thing that we need them to do. Also, if you're the teacher examiner, you must answer very briefly to any questions. Yes, I agree, or no, I don't know. Yes, that makes sense. Because you don't want to take their speaking time. So again, it's worth, when I go as a visiting examiner, I always say to the students when we have the little discussion at the beginning to introduce myself, look, you can ask, I'm pleased, I'd like you to ask me some questions, but please don't be offended if I seem very, very brief in my answers. It's not that I'm not interested in your questions, it's just that I don't want to take your exam time. Now, there are some optional generic questions. So there's a guide to the sort of question. These are in the materials which are sent out and on the website as well, that sort of help you to make sure that your students meet the requirements of the assessment criteria. For example, to elicit examples and information to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of the cultural and social context, and also to analyze aspects of the theme by developing and justifying their arguments and forming conclusions. But if you think about it, when we talk about knowledge and understanding, what we're looking for, and about analysis, we're looking for what do you know and why does it matter? So obviously a student, when they give you lots of factual information, what we're wanting you to do is to ask them effectively, why is that important? How does that connect with, and so on. So for analysis, the analysis bit, people get very kind of confused about what we mean by analysis, but really for the purposes of this test, it's making sure that they've said not just what they know, but why it matters, why it's important within the context of the world where the language that they're learning is spoken. And so there are those examples, which we can just have a little look through. There we go. Okay. And you'll have a copy of the resources. We'll talk to you again in a moment about where you can find those, so you'll be able to find those. But actually keep in mind that idea of naturalness, because that's important. So for task one, then, what do they get the marks for? Well, there are 3 assessment criteria grids that apply to task one. So they get 12 marks for what we'd call assessment objective 4, and that's knowledge and understanding of society and culture. Now, society and culture in the context of the society and culture where the language is spoken. So we don't want to hear anything about anywhere that isn't a place where the language is spoken. Okay, that's important. And if you're teaching one of those subjects where certain themes are the wider French, Spanish, German, for example, speaking world would be theme 2, but themes 1, 3, and 4 are only France, Spain, and Germany. Again, students should stay there in terms of the examples that they give and the examples that they use. And this is quite important, I think, you know, particularly if you have native speaker students in Spanish, maybe from somewhere in South America. But actually, when we're talking about those Spain-only topics, we need to be talking about Spain only. And the marks are given for knowledge, what do you know, and understanding, why does it matter? Why is that important within the society and culture of the countries and communities where the language is spoken? So there are 12 marks for that, and that's the marks for the content, if you like. There are then also 12 marks for accuracy and range of language. So it's how well do they use the language, and it's not just range of grammar, it's also range of vocabulary and the fluency with which they speak. And then crucially, and this is really important, there are those 6 marks for interaction. So that interaction is the measure of the naturalness of the discussion. Have they asked some questions? And they can be very simple questions, but have they engaged you as the other person in this discussion? Have they checked whether you understand or agree with them? And also have they used the questions that they've asked as a sort of springboard to bounce off and answer not just the question, but the wider implications of the question, and for example by giving other examples or by connecting what they say with other aspects of the topic. And so in addition to the assessment criteria grids and guidance, also we provide indicative content for each of the stimulus cards. So if you have a look in the past papers on the website, you will have some idea of the sort of thing that the principal examiners who are setting these assessments are hoping that students might talk about. But actually anything they say that indicates that they have knowledge, so they know things and they understand that they can say why those things matter within the context of society and culture. And if they can then do it in good language and with good interaction, anything they talk about is absolutely fine as long as it is reasonable and valid. Sometimes as well, we have questions from teachers about things like if they want to talk about statistics or specific sort of factual information, are examiners actually going to sort of check that? And I think it's important to understand that those statistics, that data, if they want to give those things, is taken essentially at face value. So a candidate who says, 15% of young people in such and such a country are unemployed, that sounds like a reasonable statistic. So we're not going to be too worried if really it's 13 or 17%, it's about right. A candidate who makes up something that seems, they say 75% of young people are unemployed, that automatically sort of rings a bit of an alarm bell with an examiner who will know quite a lot about the target language, culture and community. And so that seems less convincing in terms of that the information that's given. More importantly, however, when they talk about things like that, is to identify the trend. It's gone up, it's gone down, and why it might have gone up or why it might have gone down in terms of things that are happening, within that particular country, cultural community. And so that's the understanding bit. And so the knowledge bit is a relatively small bit. It's the factual bit, but the understanding bit is really important. Okay. So in terms of task 1 and a teacher examiner checklist, you need to make sure that you ask the 2 compulsory questions exactly as they are printed on the card. Now, you mustn't change or amend the questions. This is good, really, for you as a teacher examiner, because you don't need to do any thinking about that bit. You just read out the question. A student who doesn't understand the question, and keep in mind the questions will be very closely related to the bullet points on the speaking card, but a student who doesn't understand the question can ask you to repeat it. And if they ask you to repeat it, you are allowed to repeat it. And you can actually repeat it twice. They can ask you, you can hear you ask the question, say, can you repeat it? No, I still don't understand. Can you repeat it again? But after they've heard it 3 times, that's once as part of the normal question, and then twice more, you have to say, well, I'm sorry, we need to move on. We go on. Well, let's go to the next question. Okay. But it's important that you do not change or amend that question in any way. And it's the same as, questions in the written exam. You would never go into the hall and cross out a question and write in your own. You accept that those are questions that are set by the exam board, and those are compulsory questions. And really, those are the only 2 compulsory questions. The rest of the test really goes in the direction that you choose. So, but those are the bits where we insist that every candidate is asked those questions if they're assigned that card, and that they have the same opportunity to answer those same 2 questions asked exactly as they are printed. And then you need to ask follow-up questions in part 1. I usually find one, sometimes two is enough. So 2 compulsory questions, 1 follow-up question. That's what I said, 1, 2, 3. And then away, broaden the discussion to cover other aspects of theme 2, and that's the part 2. So the other aspects of the overall theme. And again, just make sure that you're observing that time limit very, very carefully. So 6 to 7 minutes. You mustn't go beyond 6 minutes. It starts with the first thing that the student says, and it must end at 7 minutes. But again, best advice is after about the 6-minute mark, you don't ask any more questions. Okay, now that was task 1. We're going to move on now. We're going to talk about task 2, the independent research project. And I'll kind of talk you through those things. Now, we talked a little bit about, where there might be overlap with the card discussion. There shouldn't be. If there has been overlap with the card discussion, the students really ought to have chosen the other card. They should be aware of that. Because the independent research project should be all about something which is not part of the taught course. But as I say, if you have doubts about that, be careful about that. But the independent research project then is a piece of independent research. And if we just kind of talk you through what the sort of process is. So for the independent research project, it needs to be based on a question or a statement defined and developed by the student individually to investigate a particular area of interest, specifically related to the culture and or society of one of the target language countries or communities. So it must be researched with regard to, and also through the means of the language that they are studying. Okay, so it must not be based on the literary works or films that the students have studied for paper 2, but could focus on a wider exploration of the author or filmmaker. So for paper 2, you will have taught your students, most people have done 1 book and 1 film. Some people do more. Some people choose to study 2 books, but most people will have done 1 book and 1 film. And so the students are not allowed to do their independent research work on that book or that film. But they could do another book. They could talk about another book by the same author. They could talk about another film made by the same director. Okay, so that would be acceptable. And they could also talk about a book or a film that's part of the specification, but not the one that they've studied. So the only absolute rule is that, again, they can't have marks for doing the same thing twice. Okay, so they mustn't do that. And also, the independent research project needs to allow students to demonstrate what they know about the subject, and also to analyze the subject in depth. Let's see a question. So question came, what can you advise about broadening the questions in task 1? Should they just relate to the 2 other sub-themes, or just one within the theme? Actually, we're jumping back a little bit, but usually 1 other sub-theme is enough. We need to go more for depth and less for breadth. Okay, so I would say probably just when you do that task 1 and widen it out, 1 more sub-theme. If you've got a very weak student, sometimes they need to deal with both, but really I would suggest you kind of aim for depth rather than breadth. Apologies, everybody. We're sort of jumping back, but it was an important question and a useful one to answer. Okay. Now, the type of task for the independent research project, and look, there's a sort of French, Spanish, and German kind of examples. It should be a question or a statement, really. And I find usually a question is a good title. The question or statement, again, really this should be in English. They are allowed to do the title in the target language, but ideally it should be in English. So things like, why are the films of Jean-Luc Godard still popular today? Should there be controls over tourism in the rainforests of Costa Rica? Naturism in the GDR was a means of achieving freedom in a controlled society. So whatever they do, it's the title becomes a question or a statement. I find that titles that begin "how far" or that those sort of titles which are also work sort of around the kind of wording of the questions that you see in paper 2 as well, can be quite sort of helpful. So we need to have a sort of analytical focus. And you do need to make sure that there is something broader than just descriptive, why and should there be, okay? So we're not just say, the films of Jean-Luc Godard, because we're not looking just for a list, we're not looking for just description, but we're looking for why are they still popular today? What do they say about French society? And so on and so forth. There's a question about whether the ILP can be similar to an EPQ. The independent research project needs to be specific, and it needs to be done for this particular qualification. So students are not expected to reuse and recycle material there, and the criteria are different. So I think it does need to be done as part of this A level that they're doing. And again, there are requirements about the amount of support and guidance that they have, which I think can be different between EPQ and this. So I think it just to be absolutely safe and secure with it, it's really kind of useful that you just sort of make sure that, and it's to be fair as well to all students. Okay, so just be a bit wary of those things. They're two separate qualifications, and we're looking to make sure that the students have done the work for this, and also if they're doing EPQ, the work for that as well, that they haven't tried to apply shortcuts. Okay, so type of EPQ again, so Italian, Chinese, Russian, and we're seeing again the same kind of thing there, question or statement. Okay. So in terms of the requirements for the independent research, then there are certain things that candidates need to do, that they must do. So they must initiate and conduct their own in-depth research and develop their research skills when investigating their subject of personal interest. Now, they also must use at least 2 written sources in their research, and that's important. Sources must be written in the target language, not in English, okay? And these can be newspaper, magazine articles, journals, literary texts, etc. Okay? So they need to have read at least, but we would expect more for the most part, 2 sources in the target language. Now, that's a minimum for the reading element, but they can carry out research using other authentic sources like films, television, and radio to support the discussion part of the topic, to know more about the topic. But when they do their presentation, and we'll talk to you about it in a moment, they need to reference very clearly 2 written sources of research. I'll also just mention a little thing about which has kind of, I think it appears in the frequently asked questions, which are part of the download. About, if a student decides to read another book by the same author that they've studied, and they're going to do their independent research on that, the book itself doesn't count as research. Okay, they need to have read an article of a literary criticism of the book, for example. They need to have read something about it rather than that book itself. Okay, and the same, if they've looked at a film, you say, well, the film had a script, and say, no, what we're looking for is written sources, and that those written sources, two at least, which are talked about in their presentation, are from original writing in the target language relating to the topic. Anything else they do is absolutely fine. On their form, their RP3 form, which we'll have a look at again in a moment, they're expected to tell us what their sources are. So we have that check. So as part of the research requirements, then, there are certain things that the students need to do. So they need to identify at least two written, okay, in bold, written sources in the target language, which they can summarize and give a personal response to in their presentation. They need to include evidence of their research findings investigated independently from a range of authentic sources, including the internet. So this is the list of sources that they put on their form, and also the things that they say about their topic, which indicate that a good level of research has been done. They need to contextualize, analyze, and summarize their findings. They need to also ensure that all material is clearly linked to the target language speaking culture. And they also need to record 6 to 10 key findings of their research in English on the RP3 form. That in English is an essential bit as well. So we'll have a look at the RP3 form in a moment. But it's important, I think, for students to know that needs to be in English, because, well, we're not going to allow them to sneak a few verbs into the exam, because they can have a copy of it with them and so on and so forth. So it absolutely must be produced in English. So the RP3 form looks exactly like that. Okay, so the candidate produces this form, and this can be handwritten. There's also an electronic version that the students can get from the website. They put their centre name, centre number, candidate name, candidate number, the date that they are handing in the form, and the unit code, which will be 9 whatever it is. So that's the code for the exam that they're doing, 9 something something 03. And then they write their research question or statement. So that is written there. Again, that could be in English or in the target language, but probably best practice is that it's given in English. And then they write those 10 key findings. Now, with those key findings, a student who does it well thinks, what are the subtopics that I've researched that I would like to talk about? So in key finding number 1, they might put the role of women during the war, okay? And so the role of women during the war would be something that they are telling you that they have researched. When you ask your question about it, you can begin with a nice open question that says, tell me about the role of women during the war. Okay, so they're using that form as a way to sort of steer those initial open questions that you are going to be asking them as a teacher examiner. So it's good advice to students to think in your head. Imagine somebody, I'm the teacher examiner, and I say to you, tell me about, or explain about. Okay, and then that becomes the key finding that goes there. Okay, and it's important as well for students to know that the form is their friend. I said to you a little while ago when we were talking about the card, but it's particularly true when we get to the independent research project, that a fair question for a student is based on something that they maybe put in their presentation, something that they put on their form as their key findings, and also something that they might have said in answer to a previous question that you've asked them. But even if you are, as a teacher, examiner, the world's top expert on whatever their topic is that they've chosen, it's important that you try not to bring your own knowledge to this test, because it's independent research. You won't know what they've researched. So you might think, oh, well, I'm sure they will know all of it. They must have found information about that. But unless you either find it mentioned in their presentation or on their form, or they've referred to it in answer to one of the questions that you've asked them, it's best to avoid that. If on occasion it does happen, and I say when I go as a visiting examiner in my little sort of talk to the candidates at the beginning, look, if I ask you a question and it wasn't part of your research, it's absolutely fine for you to, I'm sorry, I don't know, that wasn't part of my research. That's actually quite good interaction. That's absolutely fine. Don't try and make anything up. Don't do anything like that. Just tell me, because if I ask you that question, that's my bad. That's my mistake. I thought that that was what you meant by what was on your form, but maybe I kind of got it wrong. So that form really is a key thing for students to be able to use to, if you like, sort of format and drive the conversation forward. So a couple of questions that are sort of coming through. So what have we got? When do we have to send this? The teacher has to do this, or so that the students complete the form. Okay, the students will complete the form, and they should hand that form to you about 2 weeks before the date that you've set for the exam. We don't expect teacher examiners to do extensive research into the student's topic if you don't know much about it, but sometimes you do just want to have a look at it and think, oh, I don't know, maybe I need to look up some words here, maybe I need to look up a little bit of information just to be able to ask them good questions. But beyond that, you don't need to do a lot of work. Okay, so is it okay to write the RP3 form resources in English if they just use them? The resources that they put should all be from research conducted in the target language. Now, we would accept that, of course, it's natural that they maybe watched a YouTube video or they maybe looked at something on Wikipedia in English, but that's not relevant to go on the form. It doesn't mean that they can't use the information that they've found. We don't know where they found the information from, but everything that they put on their form as a source of information should be originally written in the language that they are studying. Okay, and that's important. We don't want to see articles from The Guardian or things from The Times or anything like that. Okay. Sometimes to help them find sources, you know, if you go to a Wikipedia page, if you teach them to scroll down to the bottom and have a look at the references, the little bits in blue, that sometimes as they click through those, that will help them find sources in the target language. Olena's asking, do the candidates come to the exam with the filled in form? It's actually, yes, they can bring a copy of the form with them, but they should hand you their completed form 2 weeks ahead of the assessment so that you can get yourself ready. So they can have a copy, but you should have a copy of it about 2 weeks in advance. And we always recommend 2 weeks in advance. Sometimes students are a little bit more last minute than that, and that's within your gift, I suppose. But important that you have a copy in advance of the exam and that they do. And also, you want to have a look at this form before they do it, because if you notice that they've written their key findings in French, Spanish, German, Russian, Italian, Chinese, then you need to give it back to them and say, no, look, it says in English. And if you notice that they've put on their form sources that are from English sources rather than from target language, again, you need to give it back to them and say, no, do it properly now. And this is your A-level. Come back, take those off. And we only want to see sources in the target language. Okay. So let's just have a think about what you can do as a teacher to help the students. And there are certain things you can do, and there are certain things that obviously you can't do. So as a teacher, there are things you can do. You can give them guidance on selecting a subject and a question or a statement for their IRP. They can say, do you think this is a good topic, miss? And yes, you can say, yes, that seems fine. And sometimes as well, comment on the suitability of the area of research. Quite often you will find that at the beginning they have a big idea, and you need to just help them narrow that idea down, because we're looking for depth. We're looking for students to talk about things that the average person who is the speaker of that language in that country wouldn't know, because we're looking for evidence of research, we're looking for evidence of learning, we're looking for evidence of value added to the knowledge. Okay, so very often, you know, if they were doing English and they said, I'm going to talk about Shakespeare, well, you think, well, that's an enormous topic. You can't possibly talk about Shakespeare in 2 minutes and then have 9 minutes of discussion and get into any sort of depth at all. So you'd say, well, actually, why don't you choose one particular play and you can talk about that. So sometimes it's that kind of thing that you need to help them do, to sort of find a point of focus. Also useful sometimes to help them find something a little bit original. And you may find sometimes we've found, I mean, I looked after Spanish, and we have an awful lot of, you know, candidates who want to talk about maybe Real Madrid football team, you know, because they love football and they're really interested. But actually, sometimes those topics are not ever so good for showing the analysis, the connection to the cultural context and so on and so forth. So sometimes just trying to encourage the students to look for something a little bit unusual, a little bit different, is a sort of a good thing to be doing. You might also, if you're doing some sort of regular news update kind of work, what's going on in France, Spain, Germany, Russia, Italy, China at the moment in the news and that kind of thing. And so some of those things could be, you know, where there's a particular event, you know, you draw their attention to it, and that might again be the sort of thing that would spark their research. And it would be, you know, it's something that's very current. We need to just make sure that it's something that's got that kind of analytical focus, where there are different points of view about it. As I say, you can give some guidance on developing research skills. I always say things like, you know, scroll down to the bottom of the Wikipedia page and click on some of those links, because students don't always think to do those things. It's also the sort of thing that, you know, AI will start to potentially help them with. And I don't think we you know, have any particular rules about those things, but it is, you know, just kind of help them with their research skills, but you can't do the research for them. So again, you can provide this sort of selection of resources for student access, but again, not absolutely, here are 2 articles, go away and read those. You mustn't do it for them. There needs to be independence, and you need to explain what that independence means. It's also really good to be directing students to the assessment objectives and also to the mark schemes. You know, it's all those things that I said about, you know, knowledge and understanding. What do you know and why does it matter? And also maybe looking at the language mark scheme. You know, am I definitely covering the range of structures and language in the way that I'm talking about my topic? And also you can give them some guidance and advice on completing that RP3 form. All those things that I've told you and talked about now, again, you can guide them with that. Okay. Now, I've got a couple more questions that oh, yes. Now we have a question that this actually is an interesting question that sort of comes up. So I have a question about, are questions that look at the Latino experience in the United States within the remit or not seen as part of the Spanish-speaking world? It's an interesting question. My view personally, and it's a personal view, is that there is enough of the Spanish-speaking world that we don't particularly need to go into the United States. But the important thing is that the research, if you like, should be conducted using sources written in Spanish. So that's the essential element of it. But I think that you should be a little wary of kind of the United States experience because Spanish is not a co-official language there. So I think what we would count as the and although it says countries and communities, I think we should be a little bit wary of that. I just, I mean, Christine, I really just think there's enough of the Spanish world that you don't need to, but nobody's absolutely saying you can't. Yes, it's themes about culture, music, art, yes, all of that. So also as a teacher, I've been told not to revise or have a look at the ILP. Is that correct? I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. So I will come to that. The support that I'm suggesting there, you can support them a lot with the process. What you can do is to have a look at, you could even hear their presentation, but what you can't do is correct it and you can't check for them. But again, you can show them, for example, how to, make sure that we've used Word documents that have checked your spelling and grammar for you to help you prepare. And also remember that in Word and also all sorts of other versions of AI, you could ask that document to read it out loud for you, so you can make sure you know your pronunciation things. So you can show all the students all those sort of tools that they have at their disposal. But you need to keep your eye on the sort of independence. Shall we, and then Veronica says, shall we advise students on not choosing some controversial topics like religion or politics? Look, they're absolutely fine to choose a religious or a political topic, and they are entitled to their opinion and their balance. We're not concerned with that. I think in terms of sort of guiding students, and sometimes those things make a really interesting discussion. The only thing I would just say in terms of guiding students is that we probably should guide them away from anything that kind of gives an extreme or unbalanced view, because as soon as there's an unbalanced view, we're not really getting the marks for analysis in quite the way we would like to. We would like to see that they had some understanding of both sides of a topic or an issue. But don't run away from those topics if they are specifically interested, and also that you're not kind of tempting them into areas where we might be sort of dangerous in terms of kind of hate speech or anything like that. That's rather an extreme sort of idea, but so I think just sensible there. My experience as a visiting examiner is that the topics have been great. The students really enjoy doing it. They've done them in depth, and they've really done them justice. So it's a nice part of the A level, I think, and it's a good experience for most of them. Now, a couple of things then that you must do. So there were some things that you can do, that you must do. You must confirm the question or statement will allow your students to meet the requirements of the assessment criteria. So that's exactly what I'm saying. Is there enough? Is it, wide enough or narrow enough that we can get into some depth about it? Is it set within the context of the target language, culture, or community, solidly, squarely, without any doubt? You also can ensure that the question or statement is not one of the works studied for paper 2, so you must make sure they don't do that. And you also need to just ensure that their independence is maintained, particularly if one of your students has chosen, more than one has chosen the same topic, and they can choose the same topic, but they should have a different question or a different statement, different title, different focus. Okay. And then a couple of things that you mustn't do. So you absolutely must not give students a choice of questions or statements from which they choose. So you mustn't give it to them. And you mustn't do a group question where they will do the same one, or have a sort of whole class research project kind of topic. Now, the next thing you mustn't do is you mustn't give detailed feedback or guidance to individual students on how to improve their work or to meet the requirements of the assessment criteria. So you mustn't say, no, that's wrong, that's right, no, and you need to do this with your language. So guidance provided should only enable the students to take the initiative in making the amendments, rather than detailing what amendments should be made. So here we're saying, well, actually, if you've heard their presentation, for example, you can't correct the language, but actually there aren't any marks for the quality of language anyway. But you could say to them, I think it'd be a good idea if you drop that into a Word document so that it checks the spelling and grammar for you. Or I think it would be a good idea if you make sure that you've summarized both your sources very carefully. Okay, so you can give them that kind of sort of general advice that says, look, here's what I sort of perceive as a general problem. You go away and find the problem, and you go away and fix it, because we are looking to maintain that sort of independence there. Okay. And when we say help and independence and guidance and that sort of thing, I think, realistically, what you can control is the things that teachers in your department, people who are employees of your centre, do with the students. Ultimately, we can't control absolutely every aspect of this, but what we need to know is that on the day when they do this exam and they talk about the topic that they've researched, they've had every opportunity to fill in their RP3 form to tell you effectively the sort of questions that they'd like to be asked, using that, tell me about, explain, give me a bit of information about that, sort of using those as open starter questions. So they've had all of that opportunity. And what we then need from that is for the test to be a spontaneous and genuine test of their ability to show off their research and explain their knowledge and understanding in relation to it. And of course, we do have this system where we have visiting examiners for certain centres, where you have a slightly larger number of candidates can request a visiting examiner from Pearson. Sometimes that's done online, sometimes it's done by actual physical visits. And so those people, and I am one of them, will sometimes go into schools. We don't know your students. All we know is the stuff that's on their form. And so we need to make sure that the students who have the visiting examiner have essentially the same experience as the students who don't. And so that's why we need to just be making sure that the independence of the topic is maintained. Okay. Now, I want to just tell you really about the presentation. There's a little bit of numbering and a magic wand that I've added into this slide. So this is somewhere where, and this is even if you're sort of starting to tire now of listening to me, please listen very carefully to this bit, because this is an area where I can tell you as an examiner over a number of years, lots of students lose lots of marks unnecessarily. And it's in the presentation. So the presentation, I said, maximum of 2 minutes. Now, again, my sort of advice is that they will have prepared it, they will have memorized it in advance. Examiners will stop listening at the 2-minute mark. And so it's a good idea to plan for about 1 minute and 50 seconds. Because if a student in the middle of it, they forget what they want to say and they need to start again, or the clock is ticking, so that will give them time within the 2 minutes to say everything that they want to say. And they need to make sure that they speak at a sensible pace and clearly. But there is a magic 6 things that the students need to do in that presentation to have a chance of getting full marks, okay? And keep in mind that this presentation is something they prepare in advance and will have memorized and should just be able to come in and deliver. And there are 12 marks available for something that's prepared in advance. So what do they need to do? They need to include a summary of 2 named written sources in the target language. Okay, so named sources. And this is where, if you have a look at the right at the end of the sample assessment materials, there is an exemplar for each of the languages. So the student needs to say, my first source is something written by something and comes from such and such a newspaper. My second source is something and comes from such and such a website. Okay, so they need to name their sources, and they should be the first 2 sources which are named on their RP3 form. And then they need to outline the author's main points or ideas. So they need to summarize those 2 sources. So 1 and 2, name source 1, name source 2. 3 and 4, summarize source 1, summarize source 2. Okay, so far so good. And then give a personal response to what they have read. And that's for source 1, number 5, personal response to source 1, number 6, personal response to source 2. Now, what I think we've found, and you see this reflected in the examiner's reports, is that sometimes the students give their reaction to the topic in general rather than the source that they've read. So what examiners are looking for is for students to say, I found source 1 very convincing because it came from the website of a very well regarded national newspaper. And I was also very convinced with the writer's arguments about, and maybe, however, source 2 could be a biased source because that comes from the website of a political party, and so there is information there which may be aimed at convincing readers of a particular point of view. So what we find is that the students will name the sources, that they can summarize the sources, but quite often their response to the sources is not a response to the sources, it's a response to the topic. So if you kind of take away anything from this afternoon solidly, well, I hope you've taken away lots, but definitely try to take that. Okay, we want that magic 6 things. Name 2 sources, summarize 2 sources, and give your personal response to the 2 sources. And candidates are assessed on their ability to respond in speech to written sources. So these must be sources written originally in the target language. Okay. So task 2, then part 1. So in terms of the presentation, as a teacher, you must not rehearse or provisionally assess the student's presentation and give feedback so that the student can then improve it. Okay, so I said you can listen to it, but you mustn't rehearse it. But actually, all of the tools available, the electronic tools available, will help them do that. It's just that you can't do that with them. But that's not to say that you couldn't have done some presentations and discussions on other topics, some of the things that you're teaching, some of the book or the film that you're teaching. You could use those as a sort of means of teaching students how to produce the presentation, how to do the research. But on the day that they deliver it, it needs to be authentic and original. Okay. And then the IRP task 2, the discussion, then the discussion broadens the wider exploration of the content of the candidate's presentation and of their research as a whole. So the teacher examiner uses those 6 to 10 key findings and the list of sources to form on the RP3 form, to ask questions that elicit information and examples to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of the cultural and social context, that elicits analysis of aspects of their area of interest by developing and justifying arguments, and also elicits some conclusions. Okay. It's actually quite useful to have a look at some of the words there as well, because, you know, if you know, one of their key findings is the problems in the South, and you say, talk to me about the problems in the South, and then you say, okay, oh, that's interesting. Can you give me an example then of that? Why is that important then within the cultural context? And so that then you've kind of done that sort of analysis, but and then, you know, do you think it's justified to argue that based on that? And what conclusions do you draw? Okay. And again, you know, those are sort of good ways to go. So have a look at some of those, the words in those things, and, you know, information, example, demonstrate knowledge, understanding, cultural, social context, analysis, aspect, you know, what aspects are. So I think sometimes appropriate to the language you're teaching, using some of those words is good. Sometimes as well, when I've been there as a visiting examiner, and particularly if the candidate's title is a question, you know, how far is something a problem? I sometimes finish by saying, you know, how do you answer your own question then? How far do you think this is a problem? And then you've given them that opportunity to draw the conclusion. Okay, but also within this discussion, candidates are expected to ask questions. So they're expected to interact with you naturally. As I say, it's absolutely fine if those questions are quite simple. Do you understand? Do you agree? What do you think? That's absolutely fine. We don't need particularly deep questions, but it is important that they've asked some questions during that, and that they've interacted. And there are different ways to interact as well. That can be, as I say, it's about the naturalness. Sometimes it can be finishing each other's sentences, or checking understanding, checking meaning, etc. And there's information provided in the specification about that. And also, if you listen on the website, there are exemplars as well. So you can listen, and you can listen to exemplar tests with your students, where the principal examiner will have given commentary guidance to sort of help you there. Okay. So what you mustn't do is provide access to or rehearse questions that will be used in the assessment of your students' independent research. So you mustn't do that with the exact questions, but keep in mind they've got their form, so they know what they've told you they want to talk about. So none of that should come as a surprise, and you can start those things with open questions, but then you need to delve and you need to dig further. And you need to be listening actively as well as you conduct this test. You won't necessarily know what it is the students have researched. You also need to try to facilitate their interaction and the naturalness of their discussion. So if you find that you think, actually, this student's now starting to recite a lot of pre-learnt information, that's where maybe you dive in and you dip in and you interrupt them with a question, and so on and so forth. Okay. So then, options for conducting a mock exam. So in order to practice the skills necessary for the task, teachers can conduct a mock exam assessment for the IRP and provide feedback under the following circumstances. So if the student focuses on a topic that they will not be using for their live assessment, this could be a whole class research topic or individual mini research projects on alternative topics. So actually it can now be something that you've taught them. It could be something from one of the themes. It could be about the book or the film that they've studied. You could use that as a whole class research topic, or you could do individual mini research projects. Quite possible to give them as a sort of assessment at some point a question relating to the book or the film that they've studied. Give them each one a different question, and I'm going to ask you to produce a 2-minute presentation, and then we'll do the discussion about that. So we can model it that way, and we can give them feedback on the process, and also some marks for their language here as well, because this is not the topic that they're going to be using for their live assessment. Or option 2, the other thing that you can do is that the student gives their presentation part 1 on 2 or more sources taken from their selected IRP topic, but which differ from the 2 or more sources the student's intending to focus on for their live one. So they do their presentation about 2 different sources from about the topic they're going to do, but they talk about those. And then the discussion for part 2 is based on an aspect or dimension of the IRP that differs from the one that they will use in the live assessment. So you can either do a generic whole class thing, or they can do a practice on a sort of similar and related area, but not the same. So just keep in mind the things I said about on the day of the exam, that student needs to get the same experience that somebody who is a visiting examiner gets. Examiners are very careful to sort of flag anything that looks like malpractice as well. And so it's really important that this is an authentic qualification, and that's about being fair to candidates in schools up and down the country everywhere. And then option 3, the discussion part 2 is based on their chosen topic, but the teacher asks questions that differ from those that will be asked in the live assessment. Okay, so if a centre wishes to listen to the actual presentation, part 1 the student plans to give, they can do so. However, as I said, they must not provide any feedback in the form of marks or comments to the student. Therefore, we would strongly suggest that it would be much more beneficial to the student in a mock exam to practice the skill of summarising what they've read on a different topic or different written sources, so that they can receive feedback. Okay, so keep in mind everything we said about maintaining the independence of this. And this is also about, trusting to teachers' professional integrity and making sure that it's not just about your students, it's about every student doing that subject, getting a fair assessment, because you want to be confident that you have operated within the principles, and also that every other centre has as well. But we are very sort of careful as we mark to look for anything that looks like it might be overly rehearsed or is not genuine and spontaneous on the day. So it's important to sort of keep those things in mind. Let's just have a look at the chat and a couple of questions that are sort of coming through. Ian is asking, do the marks for AO1, 3 and 4 ignore the content of the 2-minute presentation? Yes, that's correct. They do. The 2-minute presentation is marked only for AO3. And if so, we would recommend that the presentation avoids using more complex language, as it can lead to errors. Well, the presentation, provided it's clear what the candidate wants to say, we're not terribly concerned with errors of language in the presentation. It's not a place to showcase language, but it is only marked for their response to the written sources that they have made. So I think it's what we tend to find is that the presentations are very well prepared and very well done because they've used all the tools out there to do them well in terms of the language. It's more often that there are some problems with the content because we haven't got the personal response. So I think, you know, if there's any guidance about the presentation, it's just making sure that we've named the two sources, summarized the two sources, and given a personal response to the two sources. But all of that said, students don't need to worry too much about the odd error in language in the presentation, provided they're minor errors that sort of don't mean that it loses clarity. Natalia's asking, as a teacher examiner, can I change the order of some of the key findings? You can explore the key findings in any order that you'd like to explore them. I have to say, as a teacher examiner, when I go, I do tend more or less to follow the order that that they appear, because I think that's sort of fairer to the candidates, but there isn't any requirement to go in a particular order. And sometimes you will find that as the candidate has answered a question, you think it would make more sense to move to a different one. You also don't need to cover all of them. It's absolutely fine. You know, a really able candidate, they might have put 10 key findings and you only deal with, you know, 4 or 5 of those because you've got a limited amount of time. If they're a good candidate, they've got lots to say and there's lots of depth. But that's always the same with any exam, isn't it? They should be over prepared, and the exam itself just takes a sample of what they know. And also this question about, will it be enough for high marks to have just 2 sources for the IRP? You must have 2 sources on your form that you refer to in your presentation. And I think 2 sources is the recommended minimum and maximum in the presentation. And I would think it's a good idea that they put some more sources on their form. But what we're asking for in the presentation for full marks is those 2 sources to be named, summarized, and reacted to. And when we get into the discussion, there aren't any marks for AO2. There aren't any marks for reading. There's only marks available for knowledge and understanding. So that's the information that they've got from their sources. So if their sources are very extensive and they've only got, and all of their information comes from their 2 sources, that would be fine. But usually we would find that students want to put a few more as well. But as I said, the key thing is just making sure that those sources are definitely originally written in the target language. Okay, let's move on. I'm conscious a little bit of where time is ticking by now. So part 2 then, what do you get the marks for? Knowledge and understanding of culture and society, 12 marks. That's what you know, why does it matter? All the same mark schemes as we saw for the task 1. Range and accuracy of language, 12 marks. Interaction, 6 marks. And then responding to written language in speech, 12 marks. Those are the 12 marks for the presentation. Okay, so as I was mentioning, just I think Ian was asking about that. The responding to written language in speech, those are only the 12 marks for the presentation. So that's, have we done those magic 6 things? Name the 2 sources, summarize the 2 sources, and react to the 2 sources, not just talk about a reaction to the topic itself. Okay, and then on you go, and with a little bit of something to say about your teacher examiner's questions, the questions that you follow up with after the presentation. You need to make sure that the candidate gives information and examples that demonstrate their knowledge and understanding of the cultural and social context. Again, that they analyze aspects of the area of interest by developing and justifying arguments. and that they form conclusions. Okay. One useful thing I find as an examiner to go is to sort of try and consciously vary the interrogatives that I use. So if we've got to what, we've got to when, we've got to why, we've got to how, we've got to where, we've got maybe how far. Do you agree that? Okay, so if you sort of vary the questions that you ask, and particularly making sure that you don't ask too many knowledge questions, what and when and who. But if we're getting some analytical questions, how and why in there, you can be fairly confident that you are covering the ground. But as I said, have a look at those in those words there. You know, can you give me an example? What information is there that, you know, what do you understand by about those facts? You know, how is that relevant to the cultural and social context? How is that relevant to, you know, Spain at that time, for example? Or, you know, how do you sort of think that those aspects are kind of important in justifying such and such a thing? Or what conclusions do you draw? So using some of those words as well can be kind of quite helpful in making sure that your questioning is varied and in depth. And what we're looking for really when we mark is to find the ceiling of the candidate's performance. So if you've got a really good candidate and you ask them lots of easy questions, you're not doing them any favors. If you ask lots of questions that go beyond the candidate's ability to answer coherently, you're also not doing any favors. So at times, we just want you to be pushing the candidate to a ceiling of performance where they're showing the best that they can possibly do, and we want to see that, and that will be specific to the candidate. When we go as visiting examiners, you're initially trying to find the level of the candidate, and you're sensitive to that, so that we find the ceiling of their performance and we demonstrate that. And I think that's a good thing for you to be doing as teacher examiners. So, and sometimes it's just by asking, oh, can you give me another example? Or why is that important? You know, so it will just be about pushing them to provide you with that little bit of additional information, which shows the sort of ceiling of their ability, and that will be about pushing them up the marks in the mark scheme. I always say when I go to do the visits to the students in the little spiel at the beginning that, you know, I'm going to do that. So at the point where you feel like you're struggling a bit, that's not where you're doing badly. That's where you're doing really well, because that's me giving you a push by asking you a slightly more difficult question so that we can show the examiners when they mark it how well you can do with dealing with a difficult question. So I think some of that kind of messaging around it is kind of important, so students know what to expect. Now, I'll just say a few things now about support, and then we can very quickly answer any questions that people may have remaining. So remember, you've got a subject support advisor, that's Rebecca Waker. So there's a click through there and you'll be able to find that contact on the website. So any questions, further guidance that you need, you can get that from there. We'd ask you as well to, if you're a Facebook user, to join the Facebook group for regular updates for Pearson languages qualifications and support. So it'd be great to have a good community of people there, and so you can join that group. We'll also mention to you the Pearson Professional Development Academy. So lots of courses, almost sort of micro-credential type things that you can do there, that you can sign up for. And they cover all sorts of things. It goes beyond languages. Those of you who are in leadership and management or sort of looking for general pedagogic things and career progression can look to find those things there. Also, after the event this afternoon, you'll get a feedback form. So it's really helpful, if you don't mind, just to spend a moment or two just to fill that in, complete that, because that just helps us to develop sort of the training for the future and to think about where we might do a bit better if we didn't. But it's also nice if you were happy with it to know that as well, because we then kind of know how we can target help in the future. Now I'm going to sort of say we'll get any questions. And I'm going to put that Pearson slide on at that point because I think we are almost at the end. But if you have any questions that you'd like to drop into the chat, we can try and deal with some of those things now. And if I miss it, do please ask the question again. Okay, so we'd talked about enough for high marks. Let's, yeah, you should get the recording. Yes, it goes. You'll be sent a YouTube link for the recording, but it's not something you can find by searching on YouTube. It's a sort of well, hidden one. This has been really useful. Thank you. I've changed from AQA to Edexcel, and it's quite different. In particular, this paper is so good to know exactly what you're looking for. Okay. Yes, and it is a more, I suppose you're right, it is a more Eurocentric, it is a slightly more Eurocentric in terms of its of the topic content, and that thing that I said about the presentation is really important to get that bit right, because I think that would be a major area of difference. Do we know how many candidates we need to get an external examiner? I don't have many pupils this year. I think you normally, Maria, I think you normally need, Maria Jose, I think you need 8 normally, but contact Pearson, because I think it will depend where your school is. And also, I think they are sometimes happy to put 2 schools together. If you've got a school not far from you, and the examiner can go for one day to be in the same area, or you can sort of become a host centre, that is doable. So I'm sure they will be able to help you if that's something you want to do. Okay, Natalie, thank you. That's great. That's nice to know you. Okay, people were happy. Okay, so we had a. Can students research about society in Taiwan for the Chinese A-level? Yes, if it's for their research topic, just be careful with the card discussions, because some of those may be China specific. Your specification will give you that information, but the key thing is that what they read must be authentically, originally written in Chinese, and they do that topic. Okay. Martha, I can see you ask, could you read my messages? I'm ECT. You might maybe need to ask it again, because I'm sorry, it's disappeared down the list. So ask again. I'll be here in a moment. Look, we're right on to the last minute of the presentation now, so I'll stick around, and if there are any further questions that you'd like to ask, that's fine. Otherwise, thanks ever so much for being with us today. I hope you found it useful. Do kind of get in touch through the website if you've got kind of further queries or anything like that. But I hope that you found it a helpful thing. Paula's saying that the link to the materials doesn't work. We'll ask for those to be sent out, but it should work. We'll see if we can get those things to you. If not, please do contact the teaching languages at Pearson, teaching language at pearson.com, and we can get those things sent out to you. But yes, we will try and make sure it does. I see a slightly different screen from yourself, I think. So okay, everybody. So everybody, hopefully everybody happy. Okay, good. A question about, if they're doing the research, can they look at an English translation of it? Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can control that. That's for them to do. But what the important bit is that the information should be read in Chinese, however they process it. I think that's sort of that's kind of okay. And I think that brings us to the end of the session. So I think I'm going to wrap up. I'm reading and analysing the novel Como Agua para Chocolate with you. Do I have to do exam based on this soon? Also, I was told to analyse Diario de una motocicleta, the film. That will be for paper 2. And yes, you would teach those, but you can do any mock exams, any practice exams using past papers from the website that you'd like. That's absolutely fine. And then the actual live exam will be in sometime in June 2025. So it's good guidance really to do lots of practice. Okay, so they watched the film last year. Martha, have a look at the website and find all of the questions from the exams from the past and practice those with them, I think is the best advice. A student's interested in researching on Tibet, is it may be. I think you have to be kind of careful and sensitive to those things, and we certainly don't want to tempt them into areas of sort of difficult politics, let's say. Okay. Right. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to call it a day now. Thank you for your time, and we'll hopefully see you again on some other training in the future. Thanks very much.